A researcher once walked into a room filled with crying babies from different parts of the world. British babies, Canadian babies, Italian babies. The sound was chaotic, overwhelming, almost constant. But then, in one quiet corner, something felt different. The Japanese babies weren't crying the same way. Some weren't crying at all. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't coincidence. He repeated the study again and again, and each time the pattern held. That's when the real question surfaced. Not why do babies cry, but what are Japanese mothers doing differently in the first 90 days of life? The answer turned out to be surprisingly simple. Just two words, and once you understand them, you don't just see your baby differently, you interact differently, starting tonight. This isn't about claiming one culture is better than another, it's about noticing patterns the data keeps pointing toward. Across multiple studies, babies in Japan consistently cry less, sleep more peacefully, and develop emotional regulation earlier than babies in many Western countries. Same biology, same needs, completely different outcomes. So, what's actually happening? A large scale analysis tracking thousands of infants across countries found something striking. Some of the highest crying rates appeared in places like the UK, Canada, and parts of Europe, while at the very bottom, where crying, fussing, and colic were the lowest, you find Japan. Only a small percentage of Japanese babies experienced colic in their early weeks compared to dramatically higher numbers elsewhere, and that gap is too large to ignore. It pushes us to look deeper, not at opinions, but at behavior. This is where things shift. Japanese parenting in the earliest stage of life is built around a philosophy most modern systems have quietly moved away from: anticipation instead of reaction, prevention instead of repair, and it can be summed up in two ideas. The first is amai, a concept that doesn't translate perfectly into English, but comes close to meaning the expectation of being understood without having to ask. From a baby's perspective, this changes everything. In many parenting approaches, a baby cries and then the parent responds. Over time, the baby learns that crying works. It brings comfort, food, attention. That's not wrong, it builds communication, but it also means distress becomes the gateway to getting needs met. Amai flips this entirely. Instead of waiting for distress, the goal is to notice the need before it turns into a cry. Japanese mothers, especially early on, stay physically and emotionally close to their babies almost constantly, carrying them, holding them, keeping them within reach, so there's less separation and less delay. And as a result, the gap between need and response becomes incredibly small. And that gap, that tiny window between I need something and someone responds, is everything. When it stays small consistently, the baby's nervous system never needs to escalate. It doesn't need to scream louder each time to be heard. Instead, it learns a different baseline where calm becomes normal, not because the baby is easier, but because the system was never pushed into distress in the first place. The second concept is mimamoru, which roughly means watch and protect, but goes far beyond simple supervision. It's about observation at a level most people never practice, studying your baby so closely that you begin to notice patterns before they become obvious. A slight tightening in the arms before hunger hits, a subtle shift in breathing before overstimulation, a quiet stillness just before emotional overwhelm. These are constant signals, but most parents miss them, not because they don't care, but because no one taught them to look. Mimamoru says your baby is always communicating, even without words, and your job is to become fluent in that silent language. When you start catching these early signals before the crying begins, you're not just solving problems faster, you're changing how your baby experiences the world. their brain starts building a model that says, this place is predictable, this place responds, I'm safe here. And that feeling of safety becomes the foundation for something much bigger: self-regulation. Years later, that same child is better at handling stress, waiting their turn, managing emotions, not because they were trained later, but because their nervous system was shaped early. And here's something practical you can test immediately. Researchers in Japan studied what physically happens when a baby is soothed by monitoring infants under different comforting conditions: holding, rocking, sitting, even using strollers. But one method stood out above everything else: walking. When a caregiver picked up a crying baby and walked with steady, forward movement for about 5 minutes, every baby in the study calmed down. Not some, not most, all of them. The reason is biological. Movement triggers a built-in calming response where heart rate slows, muscles relax, and stress hormones drop as the baby's nervous system recognizes a familiar pattern. I'm being carried, I'm moving, I'm safe. No expensive tools, no complicated techniques, just 5 minutes of walking. Of course, this level of constant closeness isn't easy, and for many families, it's not even realistic. Work, responsibilities, lack of support all play a role. And even in Japan, this approach comes with trade-offs, as children raised this way may develop independence slightly later compared to some Western norms, though both paths still lead to healthy, capable adults. So this isn't about copying everything, it's about extracting what actually matters. Start simple. Try a pre-cry scan each morning, just 1 minute of observing your baby without distraction, learning their baseline and the small signals that come before the big ones. Use the 5-minute walk when your baby is inconsolable. Pick them up, walk with smooth, steady steps, and let biology do the work. Reduce the gap wherever you can. Even responding slightly earlier before the cry escalates changes the entire interaction. And most importantly, shift your question from, how do I respond when my baby cries, to, what does my baby need before they have to cry? That shift from reacting to anticipating captures the entire philosophy. Because in the end, a crying baby isn't a broken baby. It's a baby whose needs weren't met early enough in that moment. Stretch the gap and the crying grows. Shrink the gap and something else grows instead: calm, trust, and emotional stability. That's the real insight here. Not a trick, not a hack, just a different way of seeing. Watch closely, anticipate early, respond before the cry. Two simple ideas, and once you see them, you can't unsee them.